want to talk today about the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. The Muqaddimah is a really great work of philosophy from 1377. It's translated in English in 3 volumes. I'm going to be referring to this 1 volume abridgment of the work. Ibn Khaldun himself was born in 1332 in North Africa, in what is now Tunisia. And he was a reasonably significant guy in the Muslim governments of the day. And this book he's written is about politics, but more exactly, it's about human nature and human civilization. And specifically, it's about how the nature of our civilization fundamentally shapes how we're able to be persons. So I want to look at chapter 2 today from this book. And I want to begin on page 95, where he says, "Man is a child of the customs and the things he has become used to." And let me go back now to page 91 and the opening lines of the chapter. He says, "It should be known that differences of condition among people are the result of the different ways in which they make their living." Right, so people, communities develop different ways of satisfying the needs of life. And those ways that they develop for living end up shaping how they exist as people. And he's going to focus on 2 specific kinds of people, kinds of ways of living that are also kinds of people, that are more or less opposite. And he says that in the title to the first section, right? The first section is titled, "Both Bedouins and Sedentary People are Natural Groups." So basically, he wants to show that there is a kind of characteristic set of ways that people are going to deal with the needs of life, that produce different kinds of people, and the sort of polar opposites are the Bedouin and the sedentary group. So we're going to talk first about the Bedouins. So he says, "Some people live by agriculture, others by animal husbandry, and those who live by agriculture or animal husbandry cannot avoid the call of the desert, because it alone offers the wide fields, pastures for animals, and other things that the settled areas do not offer." So that's the main sort of starting point, right? That there are ways of satisfying the needs of our life, for a community, that basically require people to live in unsettled areas. There's a range of unsettled areas, and specifically he wants to say those people who are involved in raising animals are the ones who have to travel the furthest into the sort of most unsettled areas, and they are the ones who have to most be on the move. And so he then wants to say what life with those people is like. He says it's necessary for them to restrict themselves to the desert. I'm back on 91. Their social organization and cooperation for the needs of life and civilization don't take them beyond the bare subsistence level, because they can't really provide anything more than that, right? It's a tough life. That's the first point. Okay, that's a particular way of living. Now he wants to talk about what happens with those people as they live. He says, subsequent improvement of their conditions and acquisition of more wealth and comfort than they need cause them to rest and take it easy. Then they cooperate for things beyond the bare necessities. They use more food and clothes and take pride in them. They build large houses and lay out towns and cities for protection. That, then, again, is followed by an increase in comfort and ease, which leads to the formation of the most developed luxury customs. Then they take the greatest pride in the preparation of food and a fine cuisine, in the use of varied splendid clothes, and so on, in the construction of higher buildings and towers, and the most intensive cultivation of crafts. Sedentary people means the inhabitants of cities and countries, some of whom adopt their crafts as a way of making a living, while others adopt commerce. They earn and live more comfortably than the Bedouins, because they live on a level beyond the level of bare necessity, and their way of making a living corresponds to their wealth. Right? So he's saying, you can look at this first kind of people, sort of nomadic people living a tough life out of bare necessity. You can imagine how, as the quality of life improves for people, their way of living changes. And there's kind of a continuum from that level of the Bedouins to the level of people who live in well-developed cities where they develop, crafts, commerce, and so on. And those people live, a much more luxurious life. Right? And so he says, it has thus become clear that Bedouins and sedentary people are natural groups that exist by necessity, as we have stated. In other words, he's saying, these, as I said before, these are sort of the polar types. Like, these are the two endpoints of the sort of story of human development. You can live in these very difficult ways, grappling with bare necessity, or as you improve your condition, you can produce a situation where people live in more and more settled places, right? And the settled people, the sedentary people, live then in cities, not nomadically in the desert, but settled in the cities. And in those rich and highly developed cities, they have a more luxurious life. And it's in that context that specialized trades and crafts can develop, and that commerce and exchange can develop as well. And he says, speaking of the Bedouins who live this extremely difficult life of, grappling with the difficult environment and getting by on the bare necessities, he says, as a result, they are the most savage human beings that exist. Compared to sedentary people, they are on the level with wild animals. But so then he says in the next section, section 3, bare necessities are no doubt prior to conveniences and luxuries. Right? You got to develop those luxuries out of these more basic things. And he says Bedouins thus are the basis of and prior to cities and sedentary people. Right? Everybody else comes from that more original setting. So he says, man seeks first the bare necessities, and only after he has obtained the bare necessities does he get the comforts and luxuries. The toughness of desert life precedes the softness of sedentary life. But so he says, therefore, urbanization is found to be the goal to which the Bedouin aspires. Right? People living in those more difficult circumstances aim to improve their condition, and so they're aiming for settled city life. But so what happens? Well, therefore, through his own efforts, the Bedouin achieves what he proposes to achieve in this respect. When he has obtained enough to be ready for the conditions and customs of luxury, he enters upon a life of ease and submits himself to the yoke of the city. We'll talk later about that notion of the yoke of the city. But he says this is the case with all Bedouin tribes. They're aiming for that, sort of improvement of their condition. But sedentary people, on the other hand, have no desire for desert conditions. People don't want to go back the other way. So that's then the first basic point, that there are these sort of two poles in the development of our human life. And what he now wants to do is look more exactly at the character of that original or sort of more natural condition of the Bedouins and see some pretty important things it reveals about human nature. So I think the main thing you have to appreciate when you're reading chapter 2 is that it's a criticism of you. But, you presumably have grown up in, basically a sedentary setting. You grow up in a civilized environment, governments and laws, schools, and all the rest of that. And that means you're not like those Bedouin people. And you might initially think, oh, I'm on the good side of that. I'm on the side of progress and so on. And we've got all this excellently well-developed life. Those people are sort of wild and savages. But he says, on the contrary, those are the people who are closer to good. That's the title of section 4, right? Bedouins are closer to being good than sedentary people. Basically, what he's trying to bring out here is that you're weak and that there's something that you've really lost in this situation. And so you really have to shift your own perspective so that you don't start off by thinking that people like you and me, people in everyday, civilized city life are the norm for what people are or should be. You got to get out of that notion and take a bigger view of human nature and understand where we have actually come from and see that the way we exist is just a kind of species of human being and not a great one. So what does he say about those people? Well, he says the thing about the Bedouin people is that they have to be self-reliant. Those people living in those difficult situations have to learn how to do things and essentially have to depend on themselves to get by. As he says on page 95, they trust in themselves. And their character, therefore, is basically courageous. Right? There are people who both know that they have to deal with things and they know that they can deal with things. So when a difficult situation comes up, they face it. Unlike us, most of us, we've grown up in, these developed cities and so on. We don't have to deal with many things. We all that stuff is already taken care of by someone else. We just have to, do what we want. The result of that is that if anything difficult comes up, we're terrified and we sort of hide from it and think, I hope someone's going to take care of that for us. Right? That's a place where then you can really start to see the difference in what kind of person, what kind of character we're talking about. And one of the biggest points he brings out here is the notion of what he calls a restraining influence. And so he says when you live in a city, when you live the sedentary life that most of us live, you kind of expect someone else to have taken care of all those other things like making sure the roads are paved, making sure you're protected from invaders and so on. But you also correspondingly, give in to their authority and say, okay, I'll do as I'm told, and you live according to the rules and according to the laws and so on. But that means you look to the laws and you look to the authorities to tell you what to do and to tell you what's right. You sort of look to be led, and you treat those laws as a force that's going to come in and restrain you, and consequently, you don't have to be restrained. You can, in your own self, you can have whatever kind of views you want. You don't even have to ever have thought about some moral or political issues. You just, follow some rules. Whereas he says the Bedouin people have to develop what he calls a restraining influence in themselves. But they're people who have really had to learn how to live and what's important. And so they never had some other set of rules or something like that telling them how they're supposed to live. They had to work on their own to figure out how to be a good and a reliable person. And so those are people who both trust in themselves to do things. They're also people who are trustworthy. They're people who are, when they say they're going to do something, they're going to do it. And they have things they're going to stand up for. They're courageous. And so they're people who are not really in any way looking to someone else to do things for them or to answer questions for them. They're people who have developed themselves the values that they're going to live by, and they're going to take a stand on them, and they're going to be very strong. So that's, the difference between the Bedouin and the sedentary person at the level of sort of personal character. But the differences go beyond that too. So also at the level of community or group experience, there's quite a big difference. So again, for us in the city, we have a government, and it's alien to us. We don't even know who's in charge. It's just some people somewhere else who are the ones who do the ruling and the controlling, and we just kind of live under their rule. Whereas with the Bedouin people, they'll have a leader, but there's no sort of institution that they're answerable to in that same way that we are. And the person who's going to lead them is a person who leads them because those people have a certain degree of respect for that person, or a sense that that person is worthy to lead. So there's a much more intimate connection there. And so the Bedouin people are in that sense more of a coherent sort of group, in a way a more self-defined group than the sedentary people who live with this kind of alien authority running their lives. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to move from government to talking specifically about religion, because we, in sedentary life, operate with this pretty clear distinction between the government with its rules and then religion as this set of beliefs that you might go along with or not, and rules you might follow, rituals or whatever else. And in fact, in our world, we live with this pretty big separation of the church and the state, and so we're quite used to thinking of those as really different things. He wants to bring out quite a different sense, it seems to me, of religion, especially, again, as it relates to the desert people, the Bedouin people. For those people, religion, again, isn't a set of kind of beliefs you might have heard about where you're going to make a choice. Do I believe in those things or not? Religion there isn't kind of an optional thing and a thing that you might do only on certain days. When you go to the religious buildings and do the rituals and so on, it's not just that. Religion for the Bedouin people is the very substance of their life. It is how they recognize what is the ultimate value, what is the ultimate nature of things. Religion, in other words, isn't a separable part of life. It's really the substance of who they are as a community and how they live. And so, just as I was saying, with respect to sort of leadership, for us in the city, the government is kind of an alien thing. We're over here as separate people. We might or might not obey the rules. We might or might not go along with it. But in any case, it's not sort of intimate to us. And so religion to us is a thing, well, we might or might not believe it. We might or might not go and do all those things. But whether we do or not, it's kind of separate from us, right? For the Bedouins, government is that very intimate connection such that they're sort of a community and the leader is someone they follow because that person warrants following, has a certain kind of, probably it's a charismatic and powerful person who has, shown himself or herself in some cases to be the one worthy of being followed. Right? So very intimate. Well, similarly, the religion is they're following the way of life and understanding the ultimate nature of things that they have as their very sort of living substance. And so it's this difference then between these two ways of life is a difference at the level of sort of personal psychology or character, but also at the level of the very structures of social and communal life. And things that we think of kind of as separate or separable from ourselves, we in the city, government and religion, are, in the context of the Bedouin, the part of the very fabric of who they are. And so I want to introduce just one last notion there, and that is the notion that here is translated as group feeling, what Ibn Khaldun calls Asabiyyah. And he says, the thing about that group is that those people are sort of bonded together. They live out of a sense of being a people or a community. I mean, if you live in a certain neighborhood, like there's somebody who lives beside you, there's somebody else who lives down the block, you see people in the stores, but they're all just separate people. And you sort of have I guess it's not quite right to call it exactly contractual, but it's something like that. You have a kind of instituted relationship to these people, such that of course you all are citizens of the same community and whatever else, but you don't have any bond with them, right? You're connected to them by this kind of external link of the laws, the shared institutions and so on, but there's no real intimacy there. But in the Bedouin community, people are strongly bonded together. They feel the other people to be, part of their own identity. And that's much closer to what many of us might feel in a family than for example, in a neighborhood. And, that's what Ibn Khaldun says. This is a thing that's associated with that notion of blood ties, or the notion that, these are my people that I'm born with and that I live with. And so that notion of group feeling, he says, that's what really makes it possible to have the kind of strength in a social group that's analogous to that kind of strength of character that we were talking about, that I was talking about at a kind of personal level. So I was talking about that difference between the things that are kind of intimate to a person or to a group versus those things that are kind of alien. I talked about religion and government and so on. I want to read a couple of remarks about that, right? He says, when in the early days of Islam, when the Prophet Muhammad came to, deliver his message, people followed him, and this huge movement developed. And he says, when the Muslims got their religion from Muhammad, the restraining influence came from themselves. It was not a result of technical instructions or scientific education. The laws were the laws and precepts of the religion that they received orally, and which their firmly rooted belief in the articles of faith caused them to observe. So he's trying to say, they weren't going to a school and being told these were things that they were supposed to believe. Muhammad preached things to them that mattered, and they followed because they felt the weight of those things in themselves. But he says, the influence of religion then decreased among men, and they came to use restraining laws. The religious law became a branch of learning and a craft to be acquired through instruction and education. Right? So that's the kind of thing that changes with the religion, is it moves from being this living fabric of collective life to being a thing to be learned and studied, right? A detached field of beliefs you could take up, sort of like you could take up engineering. At that point, whether it's true or false, it's really changed its relationship to what you are. Right? It's a matter of intellectual and theoretical relationship, not a kind of living matter of the heart. Right? And with law, similarly, he said, the restraining influence among Bedouin tribes comes from their sheikhs and leaders. It results from the great respect and veneration they enjoy among their people. Right? And so that's what leadership is. And so how does defense come about in that context? Well, he says, the defense and protection of those groups are successful only if they are a closely knit group of common descent. Right? These people are going to defend themselves because they feel like they are a single group. Right? And he says, in that context, compassion and affection for one's blood relations and relatives exists in them. Right? So that's what that community is like. But again, that's in contrast to what happens in sedentary life, right? This is back on page 96. Governmental and educational laws destroy fortitude because their restraining influence is something that comes from outside. Right? So, people set up governments and have militias. They build walls, and they invest this other separate agency with the responsibility of ruling and protecting. Right? So with religion and with government, there you see that thing I was saying about how you get that split from sort of intimacy to a kind of alienated and separate thing. Right? Well, so going back then to those first people, right? With those first people, the thing I'm trying to stress when it comes to defending the community out of group feeling, or participating in the religion out of a profound experience of its truth and relevance. Right? The thing about those situations is that the people we're talking about there are people who are kind of in touch with why that thing matters. Right? The things, the issue, defense or truth is right there in front of them, and they engage with it powerfully because they are in touch with its relevance. Right? Whereas defense is a very theoretical matter for people in the city. You've heard that there are wars. You've heard that those things happen. But it's not a live issue for you. And even thinking about the people around you, like, yeah, you'd like them to be safe, but you don't feel the urgency of that the way you might, on the contrary, feel that for your young son or daughter, right? In those cases, often you feel, oh God, I really got to protect that person. You don't really feel that typically for your neighbor. And same with, these religious issues. You go to school and your mom and dad tell you got to believe this, you got to do that, and you got a bunch of people telling you this is a fact, this is a fact, this is a fact, you have to dress like this, you have to act like this. And you follow those rules, but that's not coming out of any living sense of why that was ever important. It's become kind of a scholastic matter. Well, that's the thing I really want you to see here then, is that issue of how in touch you are with the real source of that thing. And so the point is here that with the Bedouin people, they're in touch with the source of those profound issues of religion, government, community belonging, those things that are at the heart of what we are as people, what we are as a community, are things that for us, the city people in our developed state, are much more distant. They're sort of issues that have been established and settled, and we live on the basis of what was established and settled, but we're kind of disconnected with why those things are there or how they're there. And so that then is the point that he really wants to make about that change from the Bedouin to the sedentary life, that yes, you can see why people make that change, because the standard of living, the quality of living seems to be going up. But there's a price you pay for that, which is growing alienation from the roots or the sources of that very social and civilized life. So I want to say one last thing now about this process of transformation from the more savage Bedouin life to the sedentary life and all that happens in there, particularly in relationship to this issue of how close you are to the source, how intimately close you are to the source of where these developments are coming from. And basically what he says is, people build something, they build a new civilization, they build something new, and the person who built it, that leader, knows what went on there, right? In section 14, he says, the builder of the family's glory knows what it cost him to do the work, and he keeps the qualities that created his glory and made it last. These people who can accomplish things, they're livingly connected with where that came from. Right? But then what happens? Well, the son who comes after him had personal contact with his father, and thus learned those things from him. But he didn't do it, right? However, he is inferior to him in this respect, inasmuch as a person who learns things through study is inferior to a person who knows them from practical application. Right? So, you, the father, accomplished that thing. You, the son, witnessed that. And so you see what went into it. You have a pretty rich relationship to it, but you didn't do it. You're not the one who brought it from out of yourself, right? So the second generation person is already weaker in relationship to that than the person who brought it into being, right? The third generation, however, must be content with imitation, and in particular with reliance upon tradition, right? The son of the son wasn't there when in this case, the grandfather built it. The son of the son grew up in the world where that was established. Even though the son was there to see it happen and retain some of those qualities, the son of the son is now dealing with something already much more alien. Right? And so he said, this member is inferior to him of the second generation, in as much as the person who relies on tradition, right, does things now because, well, that's the way it's done. Second generation does it because that son saw it come into being. First generation brought it into being, right? Now it's just carrying on something that's already established, right? In as much as a person who relies upon tradition is inferior to a person who exercises independent judgment. The fourth generation, then, is inferior to the preceding ones in every respect, because its member has lost the qualities that preserved the edifice of its glory. In fact, he even despises those qualities, right? Now the son of the son of the son grew up just reaping the benefits of living on the basis of all these established things. And in fact, from that point of view, that kind of rough person who brought it into being looks kind of like a wild, untamed beast, and who would want to be like that, right? So, in basically, he says, in 4 generations, you produce 4 really different kinds of being, from the strong person intimately connected with those things who brought these new cultural realities into being, through these other generations, ultimately to the person who has no meaningful connection to the origin, simply lives on the basis of the fruits of what is accomplished, and now can no longer even see a meaningful connection to that person who introduced it. In fact, you don't like those qualities. You don't like those kind of people, right? And that means by the end, the people who most live on the basis of those great things that were accomplished are the ones who would in themselves be the least capable of bringing such a thing into being. So the very strong people started that thing, and what they produced in the end are very weak people. And that, among other things, means people ripe for being taken over. But it at least means people who no longer bring to their civilization the resources that brought it into being, and therefore that are capable of developing and sustaining and enhancing it. So in that case, the civilization has now become a kind of a dead shell. So I'll leave it there, but that's what I wanted to present as the basic story of these 2 types, the Bedouin and the Sedentary, where we see both very different kinds of personal characteristics that those people have, but also the different kinds of relationship they have to larger social structures. And we can see that there is actually a meaningful path between them, such that advance isn't unambiguously progress. In some respects, it's you could see it as a kind of decay.